Chapter 13. I grabbed a quick sip of my extra thick coffee milkshake and said into the phone, "Mr. Bender, I'm from Chicago. I'm not sure what you mean about not drinking downstream from the herd." I could hear Harry Bender clear his throat. I've just told him how things had gone with Eldon. Mrs. Gladstone had asked me to pass it along. Oh, wait a minute. I pictured horses relieving themselves in a pure mountain stream. I made a face. I get it. You're catching on, Harry Bender said. Got to find us a safe place in this situation. In AA, we say, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. AA stands for Alcoholics Anonymous, an important organization that helps people stop drinking. You're in AA? 23 years. Wow, I really respect that, sir. We got my dad to go to one meeting. He stormed home, saying he didn't need to be sitting around with all those losers. Saved my bacon, I'll tell you. I was flat out in the gutter, slurping slop. You tell Maddie I'm finding support for her out in the field. Lots of stockholders want the company to stay like it is, but Eldon's talking big money and people like that kind of talk. Is she going to lose the company, sir? Not while I'm breathing. I smiled. I'm looking forward to meeting you, Mr. Bender. We'll have us a high old time. See you in Texas. Mrs. Gladstone had her meetings in her hotel room over the next few days so she could stay in bed and nurse her bad hip. She insisted on getting completely dressed, right down to matching shoes, and then laid down in bed. I mentioned that her hip seemed to be doing worse, and she nearly bit my head off. She wouldn't let anyone feel sorry for her, and the minute anyone did, she'd just wave it off like no one had the right to care. She got away with this with me and 3 store managers. The knock on the door sounded like someone was using a brick. Mrs. Gladstone folded those skinny arms of hers and said, "Well, here we go." "I'll see who's there, ma'am." "I know who's there. If you don't open that door, she's just going to knock it down." The knock came louder. "Coming," I said, moving quickly to the door. I opened it and looked down at a very attractive gray-haired woman in a white suit and a crisp yellow blouse and spectator pumps. She patted down her straw hat with the navy ribbon and shook her hand hard. This woman had a grip. "Alice Lovett," she announced. "Retired shoe model." Jenna Boiler, team driver." Alice Lovett marched into the room, took one look at Mrs. Gladstone, and said, "Madeline, you look like the devil himself. I'm going to feel sorry for you whether you like it or not." "I don't like it," Mrs. Gladstone spat. "Tough kahunas." Alice Lovett spat back, took off her hat, and sat down on the chair near the bed. I figured she was pushing 70, which is probably the only way to approach that age. She looked like an ad for an older person's personal product like Depends or Metamucil that wants everyone to believe that no matter how old a human being gets, they can still live a good life, even if their waste disposal system goes south. "Mrs. Lovett, can I get you something to drink?" Her face got hard. "Everyone calls me Alice. I don't answer to anything else." "Sorry." I backed off to the corner. "Madeline, what can I do for you?" Alice demanded. Mrs. Gladstone sat there for the longest time without saying anything as Alice started at her. Finally, "I suppose, Alice, you can listen." Alice kicked off her size 5.5 white and blue spectator pumps, stuck her feet on the bed, and listened. Mrs. Gladstone told her everything. "Your own son?" Alice said and studied Mrs. Gladstone's wrinkled face. Mrs. Gladstone tried staring back at her like nothing was wrong, but Alice wouldn't let her. She inched up close. "Madeline, I've known you for 41 years, and every one of them's been a challenge. I've seen you go to work with a 104-degree fever. I've watched you collapse from exhaustion after weeks of 18-hour days. I've seen you refuse to cry at your own husband's funeral. But I want you to answer me the way it really is. Can you make it to Texas?" Mrs. Gladstone sat as straight as she could. "Well, of course I can." Alice yanked on her spectators. patted down her hat. I'd say, Madeline, that's mostly bull. But you know me, honey. I've always liked a good fight. I'm coming with you. But first, Jenna and I are going to get you a wheelchair. Mrs. Gladstone reared up like a wild horse. I will not sit in one of... Alice Lovett, retired shoe model, put her hands on her hips like Mrs. Gladstone was a dog who just messed the rug. You haven't got a whole lot to say about it. Sticking Mrs. Gladstone in a wheelchair and expecting her to cooperate was like plopping a chicken in a church pew and telling it not to squawk. I will walk to the elevator, Mrs. Gladstone shouted. Alice planted her feet in front of the elevator door and stood tough. Madeline, you hush! I turned away so that they wouldn't see me laughing. Mrs. Gladstone had met her match, and it was doing me a whole lot of good. Alice looked at me. Have you ever thought of wearing bangs, Jenna? I put my hand self-consciously over my forehead. No. Bangs would frame your eyes. You have very nice eyes. Alice studied me like I was incomplete. And more green, she said. You ought to wear more green with your hair. My grandmother used to tell me that. Green's hard to find, I muttered, feeling ugly. The elevator door opened. Not always, Alice said and pushed Mrs. Gladstone inside. We rode to the main lobby in silence. When the door opened, Eldon Gladstone, shoe rodent, was there to greet us.